Welcome everyone to our library talk. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Stephen Ecker. I'm an assistant professor of church history and Reformation studies here at Southeastern. And along with me today, we're honored and privileged to have Dr. Gordon here from Yale Divinity School. He also teaches in the School of History as well up at Yale. So very grateful to have you here, Dr. Gordon. And as we get started, let me also just say a word of thanks to our librarian, to Jason Fowler, and to one of his assistants, Dougal McLaurin, who has helped us set up the event here, has helped to do all of the logistical behind-the-scenes work. So thank you very much, gentlemen, for giving us this unique opportunity. So one of the things that we want to do today is we sit sort of at an interesting place in history. This, of course, being 2017, is the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. And so we know that all across not only America, but certainly all throughout Europe, people are beginning to think about the Reformation, beginning to engage the ideas that took place 500 years ago and so on. And I think certainly for myself as a historian, one of the things that I'm so thankful for in that is people are beginning to reinvest themselves into a world, Dr. Gordon, that you and I basically try to live in, in many respects, to sort of dive back in. Well, but to sort of spend time in the 16th century, and as a part of that, one of the things that I love is this is going to give people a chance to actually start reading the Reformers, and it's going to be a chance for them to not only hear about others describing and telling the story of these men and women from the 16th century, but to actually get back into the sources themselves to see what they actually wrote. And so as exciting and as invigorating as that might be, as well, I think that can potentially come with some pitfalls. Because come with some pitfalls as to how do we read the Reformers who live in such a distant place from us in terms of time, and a disparate world, really, from our own 21st century. And so what we want to do today is begin to have just sort of an informal discussion on that very question. This is really a question of historical methodology, but how do we actually read the Reformers? And as we do that, how are we able to help them to sort of speak to our age and us to as well begin to understand their world? So that's a little bit of really what we want to do here. What we'll do is we'll have a little bit of a back and forth dialogue here, Dr. Gordon and myself, and then in just a little bit we're going to open it up. So if you have questions, you'll get a chance to ask us or stump the professor, as it were. So so Dr. Gordon, that in mind, let's just think for just a moment here, given the fact that so many people are going to be reading the Reformers and so on. It's not just as simple as some might think in terms of reading these historic documents. So just begin to discuss with us a little bit of some of the concerns or the pitfalls that might come with reading something that is 500 years old and again, a distant place and a very different world than we live in.
Yeah. Well, first of all, good morning. I have to confess that I feel a little apprehensive about speaking so loudly in a library. I was brought up that you had to sort of whisper, so but I understand it's fine here. Yes, this is 500th anniversary of the Reformation. You know, a lot of people are talking about what are we actually doing? Is this a celebration? What actually are we marking, and who is it that we're actually thinking about? And I think it's fair to say that the dominant figure in this year is Martin Luther. He is 1517, obviously associated with the 95 Theses, but it also speaks to an enduring sense that the Reformation is really about Luther, that his experience of his conversion experience, his coming through teaching the Bible, he was a professor of Bible, to positions such as justification by faith alone, scripture alone, what are referred to as the soli, the only, or alone. But one of the interesting questions, and again, I'll try and get to your question in a moment. But one of the really interesting questions is, which Luther are we going to remember? There's the traditional view of the Reformation, as I say, which is very Luther-centered, and I think it's fair to say that in Germany, where a lot of this, anniversary is so important, many Germans say that this Reformation is primarily a German event, and that Luther is at the absolute core. Well, one of the questions we might say, well, what about the other significant reformers of this period? Zwingli, Calvin, but not just those ones, but a whole range of other people. And so I think to take on the question that you're asking about how do we approach this, I think the balance is, as you've already raised, is to have a sense of the contexts in which they wrote. And that means this, that almost none of the reformers wrote works that were to be treated in isolation. Almost all of the reformers wrote works that were responding to debates that were unfolding. Zwingli never had the time in the 1520s, simply to sit in his study and write a summary of doctrine. He was almost always writing into response to, whether it was Catholics or what become known as the Anabaptists. He's responding on infant baptism. He's responding on the notion of the covenant. And then, of course, with Luther, this great debate about the Lord's Supper. What is the nature of the sacrament? One of the reasons I think it's really important for us to have a sense of context is that these people were always living in contexts and writing in contexts. Calvin, we talked a bit about this yesterday, he writes probably the most famous kind of compendium of theology of Protestant reformers. But as we were, again, talking about yesterday, that was a book that was constantly evolving and responding to events in his life, responding to his own study. So I think one of the balance we want is to get, I think, two things. One is that to learn more about the contexts that these people were writing in, to think about what questions they were answering. So often when we read texts, they will emphasize one theme or one question more than another, and that's partly need to know who were they talking to, who were they in debate with, who else were they reading. Because none of them existed in isolation. They all were in close contact. They read each other's works. They knew what others were writing. Frequently, with Calvin, people, and he would send his works, before they were printed, he would send them to people he really trusted, like Heinrich Bullinger in Zurich, and ask for feedback. He would give it to his friends, Guillaume Farel or Pierre Viret, and say, read this before it goes into print. And so we have letters back and forth. They were reading each other's works. Well, we kind of need to know about that these people existed in relationships with each other, that their thought was not simply individual, but reflected a kind of community of reformers. We need to know the contexts in which they're writing. But what I was saying, and I think you made this point very effectively, is that doesn't mean you have to be an expert on the 16th century before you can read any of this. It's not a kind of museum piece or something that's behind glass, and we can only just sort of look at it and not really see. The strength of it and kind of wonder of it is the ways in which Calvin's Institutes, Luther's works, Hubmeier's works, Schwenkfeld, all these people are being read today and profitably. But I think we want to have a balance between having a sense of the world in which they wrote this, and then to think very carefully about what it is that we bring to their texts when we read them. What is it that shapes our way of hearing their voices? They spoke in a language of the 16th century, and we need to learn that language. But that language still translates into our culture.
Yeah, that's good. There's a couple of themes in there that I really think are interesting and would be sort of fun to tease out. You talk a little bit here about the importance of the community of the reformers. We oftentimes, especially in a Baptistic tradition, we oftentimes sort of cherry pick specific individual figures. So somebody like Martin Luther, somebody like John Calvin, and so on, and they become sort of the champion pieces for our understanding of the Reformation. One of the things that I so appreciated about your book, your biography of Calvin from 2009, is that's actually not just a book about Calvin. You tell the backstory of these other really interesting figures, men like Philip Melanchthon, Heinrich Bullinger, and so on. So talk with us for just a little bit about why is it that our tradition, for instance, looks at and only knows about people like a Martin Luther, as opposed to knowing about an Andreas Karlstadt, who was an equally important figure in the 16th century in Wittenberg, and yet we know very little about someone like that.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think there's several reasons behind that. One is, we read the texts that are available to us. We read, for the most part, we read Calvin's 1559 Institutes because that's the translation we have of that. We don't. There are now subsequently there have been some translations of the earlier editions. We have the 1536, and we have one from the early a translation of the French from the early 1540s. But on the whole, we read the texts that are available to us. And one of the things we don't really think about is that why do we have those translations? Because certain people in the past decided which reformers would be translated. So we have Calvin, we have Luther. On your office wall you have the complete works of Luther. At least most of them. Not the English version doesn't have all of Luther's works, but we have Luther readily available. We have it online. You can search Calvin's commentaries online. You can, but go and look for Philip Melanchthon. We have almost nothing. Philip Melanchthon in the 16th century was extraordinarily influential. His version of the Loci Communes, his major theological work, profoundly shaped the way in which Calvin reworked his Institutes. Well, now you can get a hold of a translation of the Loci Communes, but for a long time you couldn't. Another good example, name you mentioned, Heinrich Bullinger, who many people may not have heard of. He was Zwingli's successor in Zurich. He was Calvin's senior partner. He had the great reputation. The refugees first went to Zurich from England. They came from France. Calvin was, for much of his career, in the shadow of Heinrich Bullinger. Well, we don't know about Bullinger anymore because his major work, The Decades, was produced. The last English version of it is from the 19th century. And that translation is actually the 16th century translation, and it's not that easy to read. We don't have a modern edition of Heinrich Bullinger's works. They're working on his letters, but those are in Latin and 16th century German. We don't have English translations of them, so we don't read them. So we read certain decisions were made about whose works were going to be available, and that shapes our reading very much. But also there's another side to this story, and that is that narratives really stick. And some of the narratives that emerge out of the 16th century, such as Luther's sort of defeat of Karlstadt, and Karlstadt fleeing Wittenberg, and traveling and then ending up amongst the Swiss. Karlstadt as a kind of marginal, radical, even slightly unhinged figure, which is very much the one of a Luther-centered narrative. Yeah. Just as many of Luther's opponents are cast out as kind of radical figures. These stories, much of which owed to Luther and his supporters himself, have stuck. The story of Calvin and Servetus, the story of the Anabaptists in Zurich. These, as you know very well, these stories are established in the 16th century, and those narratives have remained very powerful, and they shape the way still that we look at the Reformation.
So it's interesting that the Reformers themselves, in a sense, set the agenda for what's going to be important or unimportant.
Or at least they tried to.
They tried to, in some respects, with the Anabaptists and so on. But then also, as you rightly point out, people who are even serving in a very, what we would think is a benign thing, just translation work, they're actually serving as editors of the period.
They are. They're deciding
where we go.
They decide what we read. Unless, you're prepared to learn the languages and go back to the sources. But even there, you may find there's no critical edition. Decisions were made which reformers were going to be edited critically and which ones were not. So decisions were made about what was important in the Reformation, and a lot of these were done in the 19th century. The Weimar Ausgabe, which is the major Luther work, was done in the 19th century. Zwingli's works were beginning to be edited at the end of the 19th century. If you go to Germany, look at who the Reformation monuments are for. They're from Luther, or from the early part of the 20th century. The Reformation Wall in Geneva has Calvin most prominently displayed. You'll find a little memorial to Zwingli on the Reformation Wall, but it's actually a little block. I don't know if you've seen it. It's almost impossible to see. You don't even know what it is. So decisions are made about what we remember. And those have stayed.
So then, for a lot of the students that are here, and even the folks who will watch this discussion online, a lot of them won't have access to the Latin, won't have access to the 16th century German. That doesn't necessarily mean that these are inaccessible figures or this is an inaccessible time period. But I think in many respects, then it means that we must take great care to look at the presentations of these figures and recognize this is a narrative rather than the narrative per se. Would you?
Yeah, I think, and I think those of us who work in the field have that responsibility to convey that there was a broader range. This is not to diminish these major figures. I mean, Calvin's, Luther's towering influence is without doubt. Zwingli's influence is enormous. In some ways, the founder of the Reformed tradition. Calvin, the great reformer of the exiled churches and refugees in the 16th century. Melanchthon, the great, in many ways, the great theologian of this period. It's not to diminish these at all, but for those of us who are studying and working on this, we need to sort of share a story that there is a broader cast of characters. And they're not just secondary figures. They're in different ways. They are the people who are, through their preaching, their pastoral work, these are many of them, and their own writing. And these are the people who are, bringing that message of the leading reformers into a whole variety of communities and contexts. And their work is easily overlooked because we don't have direct access to them in the same way. And we forget about many of the people who in their own day were incredibly influential.
It's interesting, too. I mean, we talked about Karlstadt a minute ago. I mean, he was somebody who was very important to Luther's life when he first got to Wittenberg, somewhat of a mentor figure to him. And I can't help but to think about the figure from the early part of the 16th century when Luther just comes into Wittenberg as a young man. And then for many of us here, we would have been exposed, for instance, to the modern Luther movie from, I think it's back in 2004, that was done. And the figure of Karlstadt in that is sort of like a mad scientist figure who's borderline insane, which is so distant from really the historic truth related to.
But that's an old narrative that has been which marginalizes those who were considered radical, and plays on the absolute centrality of Martin Luther.
This is one of the things I try to do in my class with my students, Dr. Gordon, is to get them to understand that as much as I love my discipline of history, it has a cruel bias in the sense that narratives can be painted and they cast a long shadow that are sometimes not the correct historic narrative. They can very much be a pejorative narrative, for instance. Even some of the figures and the movements from across the generations, like the Anabaptists from the Reformation period, the Separatists, the Puritans, sometimes those names aren't even given to the groups. They end up being sort of affixed to them as pejoratives. They've just almost been redeemed in some sense in a modern context, just the terms themselves. So it's fascinating to see the way in which decisions that are made in history, rightly or wrongly, can have a lasting impact.
Well, think about all of us who are involved in teaching, whatever form that takes. That involves we have a certain amount of time. The semester lasts a certain number of weeks. The class lasts a certain number of hours. What are you choosing to teach, and what are you not choosing to teach in that time? Well, anyone who's written a book knows that they are deciding what's going to go into it and what they don't have, they're not able to bring into that. And that what they don't bring in can be a vast amount of material. But it's just, they've done their research, but you have to make decisions about, and historians are always doing that. They're making decisions about the material they have. They're editing it. They're responsible to other people who will edit their work. So we all tell of versions of this which are based on what we think is the best way, but nevertheless we're making those decisions.
It's fascinating.
And whether it's teaching or writing, or whether you're writing a paper or you're writing a dissertation, we're all as writers making decisions about what we think is important, what we think is less important, what we don't have space for, and where we want to focus. And when you read something that I've read, you will see things that are missing. And you say, well, why doesn't he talk about that? Why didn't he ask this question? Well, that's because we brought different approaches to the question. And one of the things we have to do as readers and writers is think about what we bring to the text that we read.
It's interesting, though. So you've got different narratives that are being sort of told, different stories related to the same figures. This is also, the Reformation is also an era that has, I think admittedly, a lot of polarizing figures. I mean, Luther is in and of himself, not just his theology and his writings, his personality at times is polarizing. You bring this out in the Calvin biography in relation to Calvin. And in one sense, he can be an extremely pastoral figure, and in another sense, he can be an angry figure. And so talk to us just for a little bit about how does the various narratives shape the way in which we're to understand polarizing figures? Are they really that polarizing, or is it just we've got different presentations of the figures themselves?
Well, in the Luther, the one you bring up is a very good example. Incredibly polarized. I mean, Calvin likewise. They all were in various ways. And why? Well, because they were absolutely committed to the truth. And in the 16th century, in the early modern world, there wasn't this sort of what you'll see in the modern world of a kind of divisible truth. Your truth may be different from mine, but they're equally valid. Or whatever this sort of modern sense of I'm okay, you're okay, and let's just stick with that. Well, that of course is a view the Reformers couldn't possibly. If I'm okay and you're different, you're not okay. There's something that needs to be done about that. And it's not acceptable for you to be preaching in a different church something from what I may be preaching. Something has to be done about that, because heresy, as they understood it, or false doctrine, isn't just bad teaching, it's polluting the community. It infects the whole body of the community. So I got to do something about that. The government, or the church has to respond to that. So what seems to us to be intransigents, often as difficult personalities, and there's no doubt that Luther, Philip Melanchthon, his closest colleague, found Luther almost impossible, because he had this incredible, as you say, anger. He had this incredible temper. He could lambaste people whom at one point had been very close to him. He saw all his enemies as servants of the devil. I mean, he really did believe they were. It wasn't just language. They were serving another authority. And therefore, they had to be dealt with in the strongest possible ways. So partly we see it as their personalities, and I think it's really interesting for us to learn about their personalities. But partly we need to understand that their perception of truth was pretty indivisible. That truth had to be, there was a truth, and it had to be defended at all costs. So it wasn't okay to have people who denied central questions such as the Trinity, or that wasn't just acceptable. It had to be stopped. It had to be dealt with. So that's part of the question where we started. That we have to get into the mindset of these people to begin to understand some of the positions they take. Because otherwise, you just get people saying, "Well, I don't like Luther very much," or "I don't like Calvin very much. He seems kind of nasty." Well, he could be nasty, but there's also a very good reason for why he felt truth had to be defended at all costs, and that required strong personalities to take strong action.
So you talked about getting sort of into their world, understanding them in their context and so on. I think one of the interesting things is, certainly for our tradition as Baptists here at Southeastern, we've seen where some of the narratives of these figures have actually largely skewed from themselves. You bring out a point, I want to say it's in your biography of Calvin's Institutes, where you somewhat tongue-in-cheek say Calvin never saw a tulip, right? So
he never wouldn't have known what
exactly,
one was.
he wouldn't have known what a tulip was.
They hadn't arrived yet in Europe.
And so talk with us a little bit about, like, there's a good example. How are we to understand sort of like the language of Calvinism in a 21st century context, even for us for us here in a Baptistic context, relating back to Calvin himself in the 16th century in Geneva, and some of the disparate contours between those two things?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's difficult for all of us is not to take an individual figure like Calvin, or to take a particular text and make that an absolute standard of saying this was what Calvin was, or this is what the Reformation was, or this is what the Reformed tradition was as it emerged. I think it's, as I've said already, Calvin existed in a culture. He existed within a group of people who were developing ideas together, who were thinking about these issues very profoundly. But as when Calvin dies in 1564, events overtake him. You get the wars of religion in France, which are devastating for the Protestants. You get all sorts of new questions emerge. You have the Protestants, the Reformed and Lutherans had to respond to the Council of Trent and a reviving Catholic Church. They had to engage with them theologically, which meant that they had, in many ways, to embrace more scholasticism.
Right.
So it evolves, and it takes forms of debates that Calvin couldn't have anticipated. So if you go back to Calvin's Institutes and say, where are the answers to this? Well, he may not have been asking all those questions. And some of them emerge later with the Puritans. Some emerge with the Reformed scholasticism. They take some move into pietism in other directions. I think the thing about Calvin and Calvinism is it's a kind of ongoing conversation.
Right.
That evolves in historical circumstances, in theological circumstances. And the 17th century world was very different from the one Calvin operated in. And people were formulating questions differently. You have, by the 17th century, great debates about the authority of Scripture and the nature of the biblical text. Well, that wasn't an issue that Calvin engaged in very much. You get the emergence of confessions that take very strong positions on the exact nature, for instance, of the order of decrees. That's something that Calvin obviously believed in the decrees, but he didn't devote a great deal of attention to thinking about the order in which they do in the 17th century. Yeah. So on the one hand, there is considerable continuity. But like any form, of the faith, it will evolve to discuss different questions at different times relating to a whole series of issues. So I see a kind of development of Calvinism, but from Calvin and the others he was involved in. But the questions of the Puritans are questions on external forms of assurance. These are issues that emerge later and become central, which we can't just go back to Calvin's Institutes to say, what did he say? Because he may not always have addressed those.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point, especially as a historian. It's one of the things I like to bring out in my classes, and is the fact that these figures are not always asking the questions that you and I might want them to ask.
Yeah.
For instance, the distinction in the patristic period, I sometimes jovially play a game in my church history class, heretic or church father. And I sort of cast and frame someone like Athanasius against Apollinarius. And they're doing the same thing in essence, right? They're trying to stamp out Arianism in the empire. They're trying to deal with a very dangerous heretical position. And really the distinction between the two is a question. It's one question that Athanasius never gets to. He never asks a question. And so because he never asked the question, like Apollinarius would later ask, relating to how does Jesus' mind, how is that to be understood in terms of its divinity and its humanity? Because Athanasius never asked the question, he never gets to an answer like Apollinarius does. And so I think this idea of what are you asking and the development of thought is very, very important. It's unfair of us in many instances to force historic figures to ask questions that they never thought of. The other thing that you rightly point out that I really appreciate is the fact that I think for people who are looking back to the Reformation, I hope that they get a sense of not finding these figures sort of static in time, sitting on a shelf in a glass of formaldehyde. Calvin, for instance, or Luther, they developed over time. Their thoughts, their views on things, and there may have been significant shifts, but there may have also been subtle shifts. And I look out and see students here, and I hope that, for instance, those students who come here to the college at Southeastern or to Southeastern Seminary, I hope they're not the same students when they leave here that they came in as. I hope there is a sense of development and a sense of change. And so I think this is a really, really important thing for us to remember about these figures, that they, in some respects, they are us. They're growing, they're learning, they're thinking. You actually talk a little bit about this with Calvin in his understanding of knowledge. The way in which Calvin thinks about knowledge, and maybe you could tease this out as a little bit, is not really a modern understanding of knowledge. It's a different sense of that. So you speak a little bit to Calvin on knowledge.
Well, for Calvin, he starts the Institutes with the whole discussion of knowledge of God and of ourselves. And it's very interesting, and people have often thought of this as meaning that Calvin is this very sort of intellectual-based religion, as opposed to someone like Luther, much more a reformer of the heart, or some of the other figures like Karlstadt or Hubmaier, or people we've talked about before. But that Calvin is this kind of cold intellectual figure, because he begins his work, we're talking about knowledge. Well, what does he mean by knowledge? Well, he doesn't mean just that some body of material that you've taken in and you intellectually assent to. That it's just simply, okay, I think I get that argument, it's fine. He doesn't mean that at all. He means that to know God and to know ourselves means to know that we are in relationship, that God is in relationship with us, and that relationship reveals our true selves, who we are. It reveals us as desperate sinners in need of redemption. It ultimately it reveals that what God has done for us in Christ, and that we are that God is that seeks redemption, and that we are known in Christ. It's a knowledge that is the conformity of the whole person to the will of God. And in that conformity, we know ourselves. But know ourselves isn't just sort of, well, I think I know who I am. It means grasping our sort of reality. So it's not something that's separated from the will. It's in that sense, it's not separated from the whole person. It's not just an activity of the mind. Calvin did not think the center of our, this is again an early modern thing, the center of our being was not in our brain, it's in our heart. And so the conversion of the person stems from the heart, not. So the idea of knowledge is a good case where we can put a modern reading onto it, which separates us from what he actually meant. But just back to your other point about interpretation, a classic example is Luther. Calvin wrote very clearly. He wrote works that could be read. One of the reasons he was so admired is that his works were very understandable. Luther, as you know, wrote quickly, and his works were printed very quickly, but he wrote on everything here and there. It was like, in some ways, he was sort of putting out fires everywhere. He preached enormously. Unlike Calvin, his sermons were printed. So we have Luther on everything, everywhere, and which is fantastic. Except that when he dies, his successors claim about 5 different Luthers as to which was the authentic Luther. So they couldn't decide exactly what was the center of his his teaching. And if they found it difficult, how much more difficult, were successive generations going to find? Yeah. And so that was you get the Lutheran party divides, radically and almost viciously between one side who call themselves the true Lutherans, and they call their opponents the Philippists because they follow Philip Melanchthon. Yeah. And both sides are kind of tossing grenades at each other, saying that they claim the tradition of Martin Luther. So it's this notion of multiple readings is embedded in the 16th century already.
It's fascinating. It's really intriguing the way in which the traditions spin off into different understandings of the figures themselves. I want to just sort of trace down a thought here. We're talking a little bit about sort of our modern understandings of these figures. How do we understand them in their original context and so on. I think one of the questions that I get the most as a Reformation historian is some of the darker sides of these figures. So yes, we are getting ready to celebrate the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, and a lot of these figures will be put up on a pedestal, but a lot of them have sort of dark spots or blots on their life, things that they said, things that they did. So, for instance, Luther, at the end of his life, writes in a very strong and harsh manner against the Jews. We have, for instance, Huldrych Zwingli, who executes a number of the Anabaptists and supports the execution. You alluded to earlier Calvin on Michael Servetus and so on. How are we to begin to think about these figures, what they did in their context, first off, without projecting our modern sensibilities and understandings on how do we think about Luther writing what he did on the Jews without looking at that through the lens of the Holocaust? But at the same time, how do we do that looking at those figures through a biblical lens, and what really are still decidedly and clearly horrible things to say about a people group?
This is really difficult. I'm sure you have the same experience talking about, well, for example, Luther and his writings against the Jews is a very difficult subject to teach. It's a very difficult subject to talk about. For a lot of people, it's deeply offensive. It's very hard for them even to read the texts. Yeah. I'm sure many people are familiar with them. They are, terrible things are said. Now, there are ways of looking at that which says, okay, we need to understand this within a biblical framework. Luther believed that he was in the last days. He writes an optimistic work in the 1520s about that the last days will see the conversion of the Jews. He's very optimistic about what will happen. In his last years, when he writes this on the Jews and their lies, he's bitterly disappointed that the Reformation, that the end days that he had hoped for had not come. Yeah. What he sees as the resistance of the Jews to conversion is for him deeply frustrating, and he lashes out to them. And you can also kind of contextualize this in the sense that he lashed out in a sort of similarly vicious way against virtually all his opponents. There's a very good a book by Mark Edwards called Luther's Last Battles, and it just shows that he spread his venom quite broadly. But that can't be the totality of the story, because the truth is, he writes these very dark and problematic things. Yeah. And we can't, when you say, look back through the Holocaust, we can't ignore the fact that those writings were used by people later against the Jews. That Martin Luther was this authority for people who wanted to abuse that, to twist it. But he offered them plenty of material to say, look at the great Luther, what he says. But you know, he's not alone in that sense. The anti-Semitism is rife in the 16th century as it was in the late medieval world. You know, you could say that Luther, maybe in a slightly extreme form, expressed what was widely held in the society. That is true, but still, that doesn't wholly explain the tremendous authority those ideas had for later generations and the devastating effect that they had, and the very great difficulties that many people, you know, both Jews and non-Jews, find to deal with Martin Luther now. You know, I have many students who just find this too hard to read.
Yeah.
And that's a reality. Calvin and Servetus. I think you make a very good point that this has stained his reputation. And when I did the book on the Institutes, it was clear to me that for many hundreds of years after the Institutes, you know, when people mentioned the name Calvin, the first thing that came up was Servetus. And my own experience in doing talks where in sort of media, so it's one of the, you can be assured that it will be one of the first questions that will come. And so, you know, it's what people remember. And we can say, quite legitimately, Calvin did not execute Servetus. He participated in the process, but he did not have the say as to whether Servetus lived or died. That was the council, the ruling political authority in Geneva. They were not going to trust Calvin to do that. But he was part of this process. He knew that Servetus would die. You know, for many, even in his own day, they thought it was unacceptable that even for the false beliefs of an individual, they should be put to death. And so Calvin became associated with a form of intolerance, which has, well, it's very powerful. When the biography came out in 2009, there was a newspaper review of it, said, you know, is he still the monster of Geneva? You know, that's what people. That's what it's did. But we have to engage with those stories. That, you know, if we're going to engage with the reality of the reformers, we have to be able to talk about those things.
I think that's one of the things that for me in the period I love, in the sense that they are us and we are them to a degree, in that they do great things, they also do horrible things. Just as much as they can do to work and to promote the kingdom and the advancement of the gospel, they can also say or tweet or Facebook some of the most ridiculous things that can begin to unhinge or roll back some of the good things that they've done. And so that's one of the things that I love about them. They really are flesh and blood figures. They're not, like you said, they're not just something in a museum to be studied and prodded. They're really just like us, as it were.
And you know, Calvin was very clear that he should not be treated as a kind of cult figure.
Yeah.
He says, you know, he was very aware of his deficiencies. We talked about this before. He could have a terrible temper. He was aware that he fell, in his estimation, below the prophetic calling that he believed he had. He was aware of his human weakness. And he would not want, it's one of the reasons why he was buried in an unmarked grave. He did not want to be a figure of veneration. He did not see himself as a saint. He knew he had authority, he knew he had a special calling, but he was also very aware of his human fragility. And often people who have looked to Calvin after that have forgotten, you know, his very humanness.
Yeah, that's fantastic. We've been talking quite a bit here about these figures, reading them in their context, really the complexity of their world and their writings. What kind of questions do you all have out there for Dr. Gordon and myself that you're sort of sitting on, thinking about now from the basis of this discussion? Yep, go ahead.
So this is kind of going along with what you've been talking about. So with the cautions of reading these guys in their context, seeing them and interpreting them in light of their historical kind of situatedness, I think largely on a popular level, the impulse is to read and try to figure out what is it that we can basically do and read about them and drag into the 21st century. And there's something, obviously, that we have to be cautious about that, but there's also something good about that, right? We don't want to just leave them.
No.
So I guess, can you just tease out a little bit more about maybe your process or your thinking, cautions, but also encouragements you give as far as how to bring them forward in a responsible way?
Sure.
That's good.
Sure. I think one of the ways to that is, there's a kind of foreignness obviously to people in the 16th century. They occupied a different world. This is the age of Kepler and Copernicus. Their things are their view of the world. It's the age of discovery. Also we're on the verge of this. What at least used to be sometimes still called the scientific revolution. Things are they're in a world that's changing. But for us, and certainly for many of my students, it's a foreign shore. It seems like a remote world. And how do these people, precisely as you're saying, how do we relate to this? Well, I think one of the ways that I certainly true for me is that distance actually is a great help. Because when I read Luther or Calvin, I'm aware of the things that they saw in the world, which are different from ours, but that really requires me to step outside of myself, to question my own assumptions, and I think that also allows me to hear more clearly what they're saying. And what Calvin, in a way, what Calvin would respond to, and an interesting place where he writes about this is in his preface to the commentary on Micah, where he talks about the prophet Micah, and he says we need to understand the historical circumstances in which Micah lived. And Calvin was always, interested in, Amos was the kind of peasant prophet, Isaiah was the great sort of learned prophet, Ezekiel, as I talked about a bit yesterday, is the prophet of exile. He's interested in their humanity, their person. Who were these people, and what world did they occupy? But at the same time, he says there is a truth that transcends time. Because what were they committed to? They were committed to the Word of God. And that is unchanging. The circumstances change. But these, the very fact, for Calvin, the truth of the church through the ages, no matter how, that light became almost invisible, was that the gospel continued to be preached. That was unchanging. That message, God accommodates to our understanding, but the truth never changes. And so I think his view would be that we need to learn about Calvin's world, we need to learn about Luther's world, we need to learn about Zwingli's world, we need to learn about what are often referred to as the radical reformers' world. But and to do that, we need to think about our own assumptions and our own what we take for granted. But at the same time, we recognize that they are speaking to a truth that is regarded as unchanging. And how do we hear that? So they're not museum pieces, but they're at the same time also people of their time. And that balance, I think, is actually for me quite exciting. To see both, and as Stephen was saying, we may ask some different questions, but we might also, and maybe they're not asking the same, but we might be surprised by what they have to say, and find that it really, one of the things that people were really, when I did a class on the Institutes recently, they were surprised how pastoral the book is. It's really interested in some very basic pastoral questions about assurance, how people practice faith in a world that seems hostile. Well, those are issues we can, people can relate to very much, and speaks across time.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, right here in the middle.
Okay. I hope this question isn't too broad, but recently there's been a lot of discussion and thinking about religious liberty in the public square. And in the Baptist tradition, we hold to the idea of soul freedom, that the gospel flourishes more in a pluralistic context. However, Calvin and Luther probably wouldn't have agreed a lot with some of the things we may view. I guess maybe they would have, I don't know. I guess my question for you is, John Calvin's view, or the Reformers' view, maybe broadly speaking, on religious liberty, what are some of the things that you might consider strengths, and some of the things you might consider deficiencies
Okay. Do you want to say something?
I'd say
Chris?
go ahead and start. I think this is really going to be interesting to tease out in relation to the magisterial reformers and the radical reformers as well. 'Cause
Sure.
we sort of look at this from two different perspectives. So,
Yeah, I mean, in where are the challenges? Obviously, as we spoke about before, they did not have a broad sense of how truth could be, spread in kind of various forms. Truth, they have this strong emphasis on the catechism, on preaching. There was, at least to our eyes, a kind of emphasis on a sort of uniformity of doctrine. So, in what sense is there liberty? Well, I think it exists, for instance, in Calvin's emphasis that, ultimately faith cannot be coerced. That it is crucial that each person come to their understanding. Obviously, that needs to be within the framework of the church. But this is a time when, in the Reformation, you're starting to see. I mean, what does the Reformation do? It creates a plurality of forms, and these people have to begin to live alongside each other. Now, that's not a modern notion of liberty, but it's the beginnings of it, where you don't have to necessarily accept them, but you need to as right. But you're beginning this thing where you have to accept that there is difference. And so, the problems are, yes, there's still a strong emphasis on a fairly narrow definition of orthodoxy and what constitutes heresy. That's very much their view, and they would not understand, the modern conception of that. But at the same time, there's a profound change which is beginning, which will create, I fully believe, the beginnings of what will emerge in the 17th century is notions of religious toleration, notions of a much more increasingly pluralistic forms of the faith, because what begins in the Reformation in the 17th century breaks into innumerable forms of this. So the religious world is changing way beyond the way Luther or Calvin could imagine it. But the very act of Reformation itself, with its emphasis on interpretation of Scripture being removed from simply the authority of the Church, is beginning to create to use a modern term, a slightly more diverse sense of truth, but only in an embryonic way. I don't know if that's what. Yeah.
It's interesting too, and also add to that is one of the things that we've actually talked about, Dr. Gordon, is there are much more communal-minded people than we are in the 21st century. We are when we think about freedom of conscience, and this is a very modern, individualistic way of thinking. They're not even thinking in the categories of individuality like you and I are. It's not that their understanding of, for instance, justification or something like that is devoid of an individual element. It is. But they're thinking much more communally, both in terms of their theology, but also their understanding of the way in which church and state relate to each other. And you got to remember here, contextually, this has been going on all the way back to the patristic period, to Augustine. So you're talking about a burden of weight of 1,000 years of doing something a particular way. And so even for the Anabaptists, for instance, for like the Swiss Anabaptists that would emerge out from underneath Zwingli and his reform efforts at Zurich, while they end up at the idea of freedom of conscience and separation of church and state and so on, they get there through the process of trying to reform the church internally as a communal people, and it's only when that fails that they begin to sort of be pushed out and they begin to find their ideas on separation of church and state and freedom of conscience, and even their views on something like baptism. They find their way there, partially driven by the contextual reality of being forced outside of that context. Not that that's where they wanted to go, they in part were forced outside of that. And so even though for like the Swiss Anabaptists, they may hold similar positions that we do as Baptists in the 21st century, in some respects they get there a different way rather than we do.
I think crucial in this, as you suggest, is, where in many ways does the Reformation begin? 1521, Diet of Worms, Luther stands in front of Charles V and says it's his conscience. That he, unless you can persuade me on the basis of Scripture that I'm wrong, and I will admit I'm wrong if you can persuade me on the basis of Scripture, but otherwise my conscience cannot allow it to be forced by simply ecclesiastical authority or political authority to believe something he believes is wrong. And so that begins a revolution, which will go down the path, I think, to, well, as various people have argued, to the modern world.
Yeah, it's good. How about in the back here?
Oh, hello.
Yeah, you touched on Luther and Calvin's and a sense of anger at times, but they also had a sense of unity.
Yes.
For reform. Can you talk more about some of the hindrances to unity, like for example with Bugenhagen kind of urging Luther to be more forceful in the small Codic articles on the Lord's Supper?
Yeah.
I think Bugenhagen was a major opponent. Lincoln was upset when he told him to do that. So do you think that was a hindrance?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, we can in conversation often push it a little in one direction more than the other. But for Calvin, just to go back to, Calvin believed passionately in the unity of the visible church, and he devoted himself to church unity. His great hope, in which he failed, was to bring the Reformed or Zwinglian tradition together with the Lutheran. He thought it could happen. But it couldn't. It certainly couldn't happen while Luther was alive. Luther was not going to accept this. But Calvin thought with Melanchthon there was the possibility that they could make. But there were serious impediments. And one of them is that many people believed that the Reformed and the Lutherans were not saying the same thing about the Lord's Supper, that it was a fundamental difference, and that each other were basing it on a false understanding of Scripture. So this was, a major impediment. But there were other impediments to this. For instance, what emerges in England with a Reformation that for many people on the continent doesn't nearly go far enough. They still have bishops. They still have the bishops dressed in all their finery. They still have a prayer book that looks a bit like the old Catholic service. So there are different views of what the Reformation should actually look like. But within that, there were many people, Calvin is just one, but there were many people who were committed to trying to find church unity, who saw in the Reformation the great tragedy of division. And this continues into the 17th century. One example is there's a man named John Drury, a Scot, who travels through, who leaves England and travels through the continent, trying to find a basis of church unity. But he encounters many of the old problems: hostility between the Lutherans and the Reformed. Sometimes that's caught up in minor debates. Sometimes it's caught up in political ones. But ultimately, there was a serious theological divide on questions like the Lord's Supper, which for many people became defining of difference. But there were no shortage of people who saw in this a tragedy, and Martin Bucer was another one. There are who really looked for ways to restore the unity that was lost in the 1520s when Luther and Zwingli, and then also the rise of radicalism, split the movement almost from the beginning. But thank you. That's important to think about. That unity was, for many of them, central and essential.
Yeah, it's interesting too. You go back to Luther, for instance. You just think about the great schism between Protestantism and Roman Catholicism. Luther would have never seen himself as leaving the church. He really sort of thought that the Roman Catholic Church had left him in his search for truth. As you point out, Martin Bucer was a great reconciler. He was doing all that he could to bring the groups together, and even something like the nature of Christ and the supper, that is a key flashpoint of division in the Reformation, going back to Marburg. One of the things to remember is Marburg there was agreement on 14 of the 15 major points of discussion at Marburg. So there was a sense of unity to a degree. And you even bring this out, Dr. Gordon, in your biography of Calvin. Calvin did he even gave up a lot of his position, for instance, on the supper in an attempt to find unity.
Yeah, and in his letters, he was very careful to try and avoid topics that would prove divisive. He cared a lot about this. He followed Martin Bucer, who was his mentor. He hoped that there could be unity, but at Marburg that you raised, that on that one point of division meant that Zwingli and Luther parted without shaking hands.
Yeah. I think too, as you all think in a Baptistic context, this is one of the things that I'd hope you'd think sort of humbly in relation to other confessional heritages. For whatever reason, sometimes Baptists historically have really sought to cloister ourselves from other denominations because of these divisions, and to not seek really the unity that you point out. Yeah, the differences are real, and we want to hold to our distinctions theologically and so on, but that doesn't mean we have to hold to those in a divisive way where we're pushing others away from us rather than seeking unity, even as we hold to our convictions ultimately. So, all right, perhaps one last one if there's right here in the front.
I appreciated your point that even historians can have their own bias in their writing, and that we all have limited time. Could you recommend maybe some resources, primary and secondary, or maybe even speak to how to balance those as someone who can't read a lot of church history? Maybe some even less obvious favorites of your own that you would recommend?
Yeah, I can. There's sort of lots of things that come to mind, but there's a new book. It's not out yet, but this is just one that's come by a man named Alec Ryrie, which is a history of Protestantism, and he's reflecting very much on the ways in which his last name is Ryrie, and his name is Alec. I'm happy to share any references anyone wants to get in touch. But he's someone who is thinking very, carefully about not just about the history of Protestantism, but how we have thought about it, how it has been written, what sort of stories have been told about it. One of the places that it's a big book, but really worth reading, is Dermot McCulloch's History of Christianity. Again, thinking very much from the different perspectives on the way in which the history of Christianity has been written. If you want, I can happily suggest or email you some more specific works. But this is a really important question: is how do we write the history that we do, and why do we write the history that we do, and what is it that we particularly bring to the way in which we formulate history? This is not to say history is just relativized. As scholars, we seek to read the sources in the best possible way we can. We seek to find the best sources that we can. We seek to compare those sources. It's a rigorous discipline. But we're human. And we have perspectives. And we don't read things in a neutral way. And things are not written in a neutral way. And we have to constantly ask questions about our sources, about the way other people write, and we have to ask questions about ourselves. What are we doing? But I think that's good. But I'm happy to, if you want, I don't want to take up people's time with naming books, but I'm happy to share some things with you who'd like to do that.
I think that's actually just your words there really, it's really a good stopping point for us to think about. The heavy task that is here, but also, this is an important job of understanding these figures and making them applicable to our lives. We don't want to ever walk away thinking that they're so distant from us that we want to disconnect. In fact, one of the things that I would challenge all of you, the Reformation may not be your area. Luther or Calvin or Bullinger or Zwingli, they may not be your guy. But find someone, find a period. fall in love with a figure or a movement or a period of time and continue throughout your ministries to invest in those men and those women who have really changed and shaped the very landscape of the faith that you and I are participating in, over the ages. So thank you very much, Dr. Gordon, for your time. Thank you all for coming.